Captain Leo Grayson had seen his fair share of space debris. It was a grim reality for any seasoned mechanic. But this was different. The wreckage surrounding him wasn't just random pieces of destroyed ships. It was a battlefield, one that had clearly been fought at great cost. Leo floated through the debris field in his small repair shuttle, his heart heavy as he scanned the wreckage. His ship's systems hummed with the low, familiar sound of routine work, but today nothing felt routine. The last few months had been rough. The war was over, but for Leo, it still felt like a constant fight. He'd lost his crew, and now he was out here alone. As he maneuvered around twisted chunks of destroyed warships and shattered satellites, something caught his eye. A ship, unlike any he had seen before. It was massive, sleek, and alien, its hull torn apart as though it had been hit by a force too powerful to be understood. Leo's instincts kicked in. He couldn't just leave it. If there was even a chance someone had survived, well, that was his job. He wasn't just a mechanic. He was a survivor. Leo's hands tightened on the shuttle controls, guiding his craft toward the wreckage. He knew the risks. This ship wasn't from any faction he recognized, and there was a possibility it had been sent by the enemy. But the human side of him couldn't ignore the chance to help, especially if someone was still alive. With a careful maneuver, he docked his shuttle to the broken alien ship's hull. The silence inside the ship was deafening. The air was thin, stale, almost as if the ship itself had been abandoned for a long time. Still, Leo pressed on, his heart racing with a mix of adrenaline and dread. He slipped through a hole in the hull, carefully navigating the twisted corridors of the alien vessel. His tools were ready in his pack, just in case there was something that needed fixing or someone that needed saving. Then he found her. In a chamber at the heart of the ship, amidst the wreckage, lay a creature unlike any human he had ever seen. Her body was slender, elegant, but her appearance was unnerving. She had translucent skin that shimmered with an ethereal glow, and her eyes, wide and lifeless, stared into the void. She looked almost like she was made of light, her form barely solid, as though the very air around her didn't belong. But despite her otherworldly appearance, Leo could tell she was still alive. Her chest rose and fell, shallow and labored, as though every breath was a struggle. Leo's heart lurched. She was injured, badly. The ship's systems must have been damaged in a way that impacted her vital functions. The alien woman lay broken, as though the force of the crash had shattered her both physically and spiritually. Her species was clearly advanced, but in her current state, she was vulnerable, helpless. Leo didn't hesitate. His hands shook slightly as he approached her, carefully checking her vital signs. His mind raced. He didn't know if he had the medical knowledge to help her, but he had to try. There was something about her, something that made him feel like he wasn't alone in the universe anymore. She was broken, just like him. For a moment, time stood still. Leo looked at her and saw not just an alien, but someone in need, someone who could perhaps heal his own broken soul in the process. He had no idea what would happen next, but he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't leave her behind. Leo's mind raced as he examined the alien woman more closely. The crash had clearly done a number on her, but she wasn't entirely lifeless. Her breathing was faint, but it was there. He could still save her if he was careful, if he had time. The alien ship had been almost entirely destroyed, and there was no way of knowing if she was from an enemy faction or a peaceful one. But none of that mattered right now. What mattered was keeping her alive long enough to get her the help she needed. The inside of the ship was quiet, eerie even. Most of the systems were down, and the lights flickered intermittently, casting strange shadows on the walls. It felt like the whole vessel was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Leo's stomach churned as he thought about the rest of the wreckage outside. The ship had been in battle, torn apart by forces far stronger than anything he had ever seen. He knew there were probably more survivors out there, but right now, the only life he could help was the alien woman lying before him. The first thing Leo did was check her injuries. Her body was unlike any human's. Her skin seemed almost fragile, as if a light touch might make it crack. But it also had an otherworldly glow to it, like the light was part of her. Her limbs were thin, elongated, and covered in strange markings that Leo couldn't recognize. He didn't know if they were some kind of language or a cultural tattoo, but he figured they weren't important for now. The most important thing was getting her breathing steadily again. Leo took a deep breath and set to work. He rummaged through his tool pack, pulling out medical supplies he had kept on hand for his own injuries from the past. He had no idea what kind of anatomy this alien had, but there was no time to waste. He checked her pulse and began to administer a basic sedative, hoping to ease her pain. For a moment, he thought she might be getting worse. Her breath was more labored, and her skin grew colder to the touch. But then, as if responding to his care, she gave a soft, almost imperceptible gasp. Leo quickly adjusted the controls on his medkit, slowly and steadily stabilizing her condition. He could hear the familiar hum of the ship's emergency life support system kicking in, and he was able to hook her up to a few devices that would help keep her alive until they could get back to his shuttle. As the minutes stretched into hours, Leo worked tirelessly. He reattached wires, recharged battery cells, and reactivated any functional systems he could find. It was slow work, and the alien woman remained unconscious, but he could see the faintest signs of improvement. Her breathing steadied, and her skin regained some of its soft glow. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Leo sat back in exhaustion. The alien woman was stable, her pulse strong again. She was still unconscious, but he was certain she had a chance now. A sense of relief washed over him, though it was soon replaced by an overwhelming sadness. It was then that Leo realized something. He hadn't just fixed her ship, he had repaired her too. As he sat there, surrounded by the wreckage of the alien vessel, he felt a small, flickering hope. This might not just be about survival anymore. There was something about her, a quiet strength, a kind of grace, something that reached through his own pain and whispered that he wasn't alone. He could help her, but in doing so, she might help him heal too. For the first time in a long time, Leo didn't feel like a broken soul. He felt like he was whole again. The hours passed, and Leo barely moved from his position by the alien woman's side. His eyes were heavy, his body sore from the constant work, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. He had done everything he could to stabilize her, but now it was in her hands. The next few hours would tell if she was going to survive, or if all his efforts had been for nothing. The silence in the ship was deafening. The low hum of the emergency systems was the only sound, a constant reminder of the fragile nature of their situation. Leo knew the ship was barely holding itself together. Even if the woman survived, getting her off the wreckage would be a challenge, but there was no point in thinking about that now. She needed to wake up first. He sat beside her, his hand resting lightly on her fragile arm. Her skin felt warm again, but her breathing remained slow and shallow. Leo watched her face, trying to gauge any sign of movement, any indication that she was starting to come back to life. Suddenly, her eyelids fluttered. Leo's heart skipped a beat as her eyes slowly opened. At first, they were unfocused, distant, but then they settled on him, wide and uncertain. Leo froze. He had no idea how she would react when she realized where she was, what had happened to her, and who had helped her. Her kind weren't known for being forgiving, especially to humans. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Her eyes were the color of molten gold, bright and intense. Her gaze held an unfathomable depth, as if she had seen far more than any being should. Leo couldn't look away, caught in the pull of her alien beauty. Then, she spoke in a language Leo didn't understand. Her voice was soft, but edged with something sharp, like a warning, though it wasn't clear what she meant. He didn't know if she had noticed the strange devices around her or the fact that she was lying in a wrecked ship, but her confusion was evident. "Don't worry," Leo said softly, trying to comfort her. "You're safe. I fixed your ship, and you're alive." He wasn't sure how she'd react to the sound of his voice, but he hoped she'd understand the tone, the sincerity behind it. She blinked, then tried to sit up, her movements slow and cautious. Leo quickly placed a hand on her shoulder to steady her. "Take it easy," he advised. "You've been through a lot. Just rest for a while." She glanced down at herself, her golden eyes scanning her body for injuries, but it seemed like the pain had lessened. Her hands brushed against her body, checking for any signs of harm. She made a noise in her throat, a mix between a soft hum and a growl, and Leo quickly realized it was a sign of approval, or maybe gratitude. He wasn't sure, but it was enough to make him feel a little better. As she processed the situation, her gaze shifted back to him. There was something different now, something more alive in her eyes. She was studying him, curious, cautious. She clearly remembered what had happened, but something in her expression seemed to soften. "You've fixed me," she said, her voice hoarse, but clearer this time. It was a strange, melodic sound, like the wind rustling through trees. Leo didn't know how, but he could tell she was trying to form words, trying to communicate. "Yeah," Leo replied, relieved that she could speak. "I did. I'm Leo." He wasn't sure why he gave her his name, but it felt right. "What's your name?" Her eyes flickered. She was still processing his words, but Leo noticed her lips moving, forming sounds she hadn't spoken yet. "Zilara," she finally said, her voice quiet but firm. "Zilara." Her name echoed in the air like a new star being born. Leo felt a strange sense of connection to her, something he couldn't explain. It was the first step toward trust. Maybe, just maybe, this woman, the alien who had crash-landed on his world, wasn't so different from him after all. And in that moment, Leo knew that everything was about to change. Zilara's eyes, still a shade of gold that seemed to shimmer like a distant star, didn't leave Leo. The silence between them stretched out, but it wasn't uncomfortable. There was something in the air now, an understanding, perhaps, or the first tentative threads of trust. Leo didn't know exactly what to call it, but he could feel it. He had repaired her ship, saved her life, but that was only half the battle. Now he had to figure out how to keep her safe, how to communicate with her, and most of all, how to deal with the growing sense of connection between them. She studied him in silence, as if she was still trying to understand who he was and why he had helped her. Her gaze flickered to the ship around her, taking in the remnants of the wreckage. Zilara didn't seem panicked or confused. In fact, she appeared to be thinking deeply, her mind working as fast as her keen eyes could see. Leo wanted to say more, but words seemed pointless. Instead, he carefully reached for the bottle of water he had set nearby. He extended it toward her, unsure if she would accept it. Zilara's eyes followed the motion, and for a brief moment, a strange smile tugged at her lips. A smile that was not full of gratitude or relief, but curiosity, as if she was testing something new. She took the water from his hand with a gentle, almost reverent touch, and brought it to her lips. Zilara drank slowly, savoring each drop, and Leo watched her carefully. She wasn't like any human he'd ever known. There was a quiet strength in her, an elegance in her movements that made her seem as if she was always in control of her surroundings, always calculating the next move. But the uncertainty in her eyes told a different story. She was as lost as he was, maybe more so. After she finished drinking, she lowered the bottle and stared at Leo for a long moment. Her golden eyes didn't waver. Then, with a voice that was softer than before, she spoke. "You are not afraid of me." Leo was taken aback by the question. "Afraid," he repeated. Zilara nodded, her gaze piercing. "Most beings fear me. I am not like them." Her voice held a kind of sadness that caught Leo off guard. "I do not belong here." Leo understood now. He realized that, to her, his kindness was probably the first she had ever received from a human. Her race, her kind, might not be seen as friendly in the eyes of others. He thought back to the stories he'd heard of alien species, stories that painted them as ruthless, dangerous beings. But Zilara wasn't like that. Not to him. "I'm not afraid of you," Leo said, his voice steady. "And you do belong here. You're just different. That doesn't make you any less real." Zilara looked at him in silence for a long moment, and for the first time since he'd met her, Leo saw something flicker in her eyes, something fragile, something human. A soft sigh escaped her lips. "You speak differently. I do not understand, but I want to." Leo smiled faintly. "I'm happy to teach you," he replied. As they continued to sit together in the wrecked remains of the ship, the unspoken bond between them grew. Neither of them knew what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, they weren't so alone anymore. They had each other, even if the universe around them was still a mystery. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough for now. Leo woke up to the soft hum of the ship's systems, a sound that was more familiar to him now than the quiet emptiness he had once known. It had been a week since Zilara had crash-landed on his ship, and during that time, they had formed a delicate partnership. She helped him with repairs, and in return, he taught her the language of Earth. It was slow progress, but they had come a long way. Zilara's golden eyes had softened since their first meeting. She no longer looked at him with the same guarded uncertainty. There were moments when she smiled, moments when her eyes sparkled with something close to warmth, something that made Leo's heart race in an unfamiliar way. Today was different, though. There was a tension in the air. Zilara had been silent for the past hour, her gaze fixed on the ship's external display. Leo knew something was bothering her, but he hadn't asked. He had learned that pushing her didn't help. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was low, almost hesitant. "The ship, it is ready," she said. Leo nodded, looking up from the console he was working on. "It's good to go. You'll be able to leave soon." Zilara's expression didn't change, but Leo could see the flicker of something in her eyes. Something he couldn't quite place. He stood up and walked over to her. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. Zilara turned to face him, her golden eyes locking onto his. There was a strange sadness there, a depth that made Leo's chest tighten. She looked at him as though she was trying to understand something within herself. "I do not want to leave," she said softly, almost in a whisper. Leo's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected that. He hadn't expected her to feel this way. He had assumed that once the ship was fixed, she would simply take off, as if she had no reason to stay. But now, hearing her words, he realized that she was just as torn as he was. "You don't have to leave," Leo replied, his voice low but steady. "You can stay if you want. There's nothing out there for you to return to, is there?" Zilara's gaze dropped, and she looked away. Leo could see her fingers twitching, almost as if she were fighting something inside. She took a deep breath and finally met his gaze again. "I have no place to return to," she admitted. "My people, they are lost to me now. I have been running for so long that I no longer remember where I belong." She paused, her voice breaking. "But you are different. You have shown me something I have not known in so long. Kindness." Leo was speechless. He had never thought of himself as anything special. He was just a mechanic trying to survive, trying to get by. But in that moment, he realized that to Zilara, he was everything. He was her anchor in a world she didn't understand. "I'm not going anywhere," Leo said, his voice firm. "I want you to stay. We can figure this out together." Zilara's eyes softened, and a small tentative smile tugged at the corner of her lips. For the first time since they had met, Leo saw hope there. A hope that wasn't just for survival, but for something more. Something that neither of them had dared to hope for. With a slow nod, Zilara reached out and touched his arm, a simple gesture that sent a shock of warmth through Leo's body. They weren't alone anymore, and they weren't running. Together, they would face whatever the universe threw at them. side by side. The days following their conversation were quieter than Leo had anticipated. The ship was fully repaired, and Zilara had been more relaxed, but there was an unspoken tension between them now. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of tension that comes with two souls walking the line between uncertainty and understanding. Leo didn't want to push Zilara too hard, but he could sense that she was holding something back, something important. He found her in the cargo hold, kneeling by a small worn chest. Her hands were gently caressing the surface, as though the chest held something precious, something that carried memories far heavier than she was willing to share. Leo stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her, the soft glow of the ship's lights reflected in her golden eyes, making her seem distant, unreachable, as though she were somewhere far away in her mind. "Zilara," he called softly, his voice carrying through the quiet space. She stiffened at the sound of his voice, but didn't look up. After a long pause, she whispered, "This is all I have left." Curiosity tugged at Leo, but he didn't push. Instead, he stepped closer, his presence calm, his movements gentle. "What's in there?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. Zilara finally looked up, meeting his gaze. For a brief moment, Leo saw a flash of something sharp and painful in her eyes, something she had carried with her for far too long. She opened the chest slowly, revealing a collection of small, delicate items, some of which were foreign to Leo, others he recognized as pieces of her past. There were trinkets, weapons, and strange relics. But it was the last item that caught his attention. It was a picture, faded and frayed at the edges. In it, Zilara stood tall, surrounded by others of her kind. They were smiling, laughing, a family, a tribe. But there was a coldness to the scene, a feeling of absence in the way they looked at one another, as if they were all playing roles, not truly connected. Leo's throat tightened as he stared at the image. "What happened?" he asked softly, stepping closer, his voice gentle. Zilara's eyes were glassy now, filled with memories she didn't want to revisit. She hesitated before answering, her voice low. "My people were destroyed. My planet, my home, gone. My kind was scattered to the far corners of the universe. I was left behind. I am the last of them." Her words hung in the air, heavy and raw. Leo didn't know what to say. He had never lost everything, never had his entire world ripped away from him. He couldn't imagine what that kind of pain felt like. "I didn't want to stay," she continued, her voice cracking. "I couldn't bear the thought of being the last one. So I ran. I kept running from the memories, from the guilt of surviving." Leo sat beside her, his presence a steady weight, a reminder that she wasn't alone. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Sometimes, just being there was enough. "Now I don't know where to go," she whispered, her head resting on his shoulder. "I don't know if I belong anywhere anymore." Leo placed his hand gently on hers. "You belong here," he said softly. "You don't have to be alone." Zilara's eyes met his, and for the first time, he saw something else. Something like hope, like the first rays of dawn breaking through the darkness. Together, they didn't have to run anymore. Together, they could build something new. A new family, a new home. And in that quiet, peaceful moment, they both realized that the journey they had started together was far from over. It had only just begun. The ship hummed softly as it floated through the vast emptiness of space. Inside, Leo and Zilara sat side by side, the weight of their shared silence no longer heavy but comforting. The distance between them had slowly melted away, replaced by something stronger, something more enduring. Trust, hope, and a bond that neither of them could fully explain, but both of them could feel. The journey they had embarked on together had brought them to this moment. The repair of the ship, the quiet days spent learning about each other's worlds, the conversations that had stretched long into the night, and the understanding that had bloomed between them. They were no longer just two travelers from different galaxies. They were two people who had found something rare and precious, a connection. But there was still so much more to explore, to learn. Zilara had shown him glimpses of her past, and now it was time for her to understand his. As the ship drifted through the stars, Leo turned to her, his voice gentle but full of intent. "I've been thinking, Zilara." Her golden eyes shifted toward him, curious. "About what?" "About us," Leo began. "About what comes next. You've told me about your past. I think it's time I share mine." Zilara nodded, sensing the gravity of his words. It was a moment of truth, the kind that came when two people dared to reveal the deepest parts of themselves. "I didn't lose a planet, like you did," Leo started. "But I've lost pieces of myself. I used to be a part of something bigger, a team, a mission, a purpose. Then, everything changed. I was left behind, just like you, but I didn't know how to run from it. I tried to keep going, to pretend I was okay. But the truth is, I wasn't. Not really." Zilara listened intently, her gaze steady, her mind absorbing the story that mirrored hers more than she had realized. "You were alone, too," she said quietly. Leo gave a small, rueful smile. "Yeah, alone, but not for long. Not anymore." Zilara met his eyes, feeling the sincerity in his words, the promise in his presence. They had both learned to live with pain, but together, they had found a way to heal. It wasn't perfect, and there was no clear map to what the future would hold, but at that moment, it didn't matter. They had each other. "Where do we go from here?" Zilara asked softly, her voice laced with a mixture of curiosity and hope. Leo smiled, his eyes shining with something new, something that hadn't been there before. "We keep going," he said simply. "We explore, we find new places, new people, and we make sure we're never alone again." Zilara nodded, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "Together, together," Leo agreed. And so, as the stars stretched out before them, the two of them set their course for the unknown. The galaxy was vast, full of wonders and dangers, but for the first time in a long time, Zilara and Leo felt ready to face whatever came next. They were no longer two broken souls adrift in space. They were a team, a family, and their journey was just beginning. Together, they would rebuild what was lost and discover what was waiting for them in the endless reaches of the universe.